The Russians have their Marines there as well. They're people who have experience using boats, but obviously Russians forces and the Marines particularly have been very heavily affected by this war. They've taken a lot of casualties. So some of these soldiers will be new contract soldiers, not conscripts per se, but people who signed up recently or have been mobilized as part of these mobilization waves that Putin keeps announcing. So there are some experienced troops going up against the Ukrainian Marines. The Ukrainian Marines, a lot of these have been trained in Britain. Some of them have been trained by the Royal Navy Marines, and they've been better used to working with boats than the kind of other infantry. The brigade that I actually spoke to, they'd been pulled out of fighting in the Donbass in Touretsk, and they'd been nearly decimated, this Ukrainian brigade, and reformed as a coastal defense brigade. Some of them had trained in the UK as part of Interflex, their kind of regular infantry training. And they're going to have more training as part of the kind of Marine Corps as they kind of step up and go from being basically an infantry brigade into being a full Marine brigade.
Mm-hmm. Did you manage to get an impression from any of them as to what they thought of Operation Interflex and whether it gave them the basics that they needed to then build on?
So it was very interesting. I think a lot of people have a lot of different views about the UK training. A lot of them say it's very good for this kind of basic, the first aid, the hostile environment, getting used to digging in, getting used to taking cover, moving in small groups and things like this. But a lot also saying it's outdated in that it doesn't account for the use of drones in the way that we see on the modern battlefield. And maybe that's something that a lot of these Marines have been trained, a year, 2 years ago. Maybe that's something that's being updated. I'm sure it's something that's being considered as how drones are just prevalent on the battlefield and guiding everyone. But they didn't feel that they had been trained as to how to take cover from drones. And actually, they had a lot that they would be able to share with their British counterparts now. But I think one of the really important things from this is the sense of support that they get by going to a European country, by going to the UK, and feeling that there's a camaraderie. And a lot of them remember their instructors. They have fond memories of these instructors and the jokes they used to make and how they got on there. And I think that stays with them, and that gives them a kind of a sense of moral support in the most difficult times that they face.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I don't think the British military doesn't have any experience of fighting in the drone environment that the Ukrainians have got. So it would be very difficult to bring that in a realistic way into any of the training that's there. And this is something that NATO nations will learn from Ukraine. But you talk of drones again in your article. You bring out and describe very well the utility of the Barracuda unmanned surface vehicle. And again, whenever we talk of drones, everyone automatically thinks of the little flying drones that there are. But the Ukrainians have made real inroads with surface drones, maritime drones, and for a nation with no navy, they've managed to sink or confine to port one of the largest navies, if not the largest navy in the Black Sea fleet. Give us a bit of an insight as to what you were picking up from Ukrainians on Barracuda and other surface drones.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you allude to there is the success of the Magura drones that have been used in the Black Sea, to just astonishing success, and really showing how big, powerful navies can be reduced to insignificance by cheap but powerful drones that are used as kamikaze, ferrying in explosives to hit them. And they have destroyed a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and as you say, confined the rest to ports in Russia, and really kind of taken the wind out of their sails in that regard. And Ukraine is now realizing that those can also be useful on the Dnipro River as well. And more and more people in the Ukrainian armed forces are people with IT backgrounds, they've got the IT engineers, they can put things together remarkably well. And the guys from this unit, they were kind of actually ordinary Marines, but they'd come up with ways to kind of save their own lives, essentially, and developing these unmanned boats, which they had support actually from Britain in developing. They had some British components in there. 15% of these boats, they say, were British. But it's essentially a fast, remote-controlled speedboat, very fast, 95 kilometers an hour, which can either ferry in supplies to people, evacuate wounded, or have a machine gun mounted on top of it, remote controlled as well, which can strafe the kind of Russian held islands, anti-tank grenade launchers, with guided munitions on them, which can also attack the Russians, or just be simply used as a big kamikaze boat, which goes in and takes out the Russians. And they say they started these with just a kind of attaching remote control outfits to kind of really basic old Soviet era boats and just running them into Russian loading points and blowing them up. And they've had great success with doing that. And now they've developed them into these things that can actually effectively patrol the Dnipro. They're very difficult to hit by Russian FPV drones because they have electronic warfare equipment and they're very fast and nimble and can maneuver very quickly. And they're having great success with these.
Innovation is one of the things that has come to the forefront of the conflict in Ukraine. It's also something that, if you go back through every conflict, has been central to it. The military that innovates faster than the other military tends to get the edge. Do you think the Ukrainians have managed to get an edge here?
Well, it's very difficult because Russia is obviously a sophisticated nation state that is capable, even if it's not innovating, is very capable of copying very quickly, and copying and then expanding at scale. And what we see is that the Ukrainian approach is to have lots of different innovations and kind of allow them to organically develop, and then to see, if there's something that needs to be worth invested in by this government conglomeration called Brave One. The Russian approach is to try and take one thing that they think works well and build that at scale very quickly. And we've seen that with the Shahed and then modify it. So we've seen that with the Shahed, which is getting better and better as a very basic platform to start with, but just by sheer weight of numbers has been very effective. And they're modifying it to make it more effective, more maneuverable, to detect when things are being fired at it. And fiber optic drones being another one that's been really, really effective for the Russians. And then you see the Ukrainians copying it. Now, with naval drones, they really are two steps behind because they had been relying on the power of their Black Sea fleet and they hadn't really thought about this in the same way. And they seem to still be struggling to adapt and develop naval drones. And the Ukrainians say the Russians are just two steps behind us here. They can't keep up. I'm sure it is a matter of time before we see Russian naval drones in the Black Sea and then maybe in the Dnipro River Delta. But for the time being, the Ukrainians have the upper hand in this regard.
But then again, if we're looking at the targets, the Ukrainians have got fantastic targets. The Black Sea Fleet. There is no Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet for the Russians to target with drones, so maybe that's why they didn't develop those capabilities. But it's interesting to see some of the pictures that you had in the article had they're unmanned drones, but sea drones, but there were Ukrainian troops using them to transport themselves out to the islands or to get into favorable positions. Are we seeing this level of hybrid warfare where unmanned systems are now being used to help move men and material around?
Absolutely. I think it's still key. Infantry is still key because they have to hold territory and there simply aren't, you don't have numbers of these kind of unmanned ground vehicles. They're not so reliable. They can't necessarily pass you intelligence back in the same way as troops on the ground. And it's still the big reliance is on infantry to take and hold territory. What these drones can do is they can support by attacking the Russians, particularly as they try and land, by ferrying equipment across. And particularly there's a different version of the Barracuda, which is a kind of low silhouetted cigar-shaped boat, which is bulletproof, and you can load your wounded troops in and bring them back. And it was one of the things that I noticed when I was talking to Marines who'd landed during the Krinky operation, where Ukraine tried to reach the other side of the Dnipro and create a bridgehead there, which they would use to push all the way to Crimea was the original intention. The logistical issue was huge for them. They just couldn't keep resupplied, and it was the boats being hit time and time again. They were losing a lot of guys going backwards and forwards across on these boats, and they just ran out of boats very quickly. And that was the major struggle for that operation, just not having enough boats. So having drones like this that you can kind of mass produce, and you don't have to have a driver, you don't lose your driver every time that they get hit. That is a big plus for the Ukrainians. And I think that, if the operation in Krinky was carried out again today, it would probably look very different.
Mm-hmm. So do you think the Ukrainians have got an ambition to open a bridgehead up and start to try and threaten Crimea from its roots in from the north and to break this land bridge that we've talked about ever since the full-scale invasion between Crimea and Russia?
I'm sure that's something they would like to do. I think they're some way away from having the means to do that at the moment. They're definitely on the back foot in most areas of the front line. There are talks of another counteroffensive. Zelensky is supposed to be discussing this with Trump further, but it's very difficult on the ground to see where that would come from, where the reserves would come from to launch such a big operation. And we've seen previously, even with the Kursk operation, a lot of brigades were dedicated to that and had some success, but it didn't really achieve a kind of a very strategic breakthrough. It didn't change the war. And you really need a very large reserve force in order to do that. It's very difficult to see where the Ukrainians would get that from. And when it comes to kind of an amphibious landings, that's an even larger force that's needed. And the logistics are incredibly complicated. So it's difficult to see them crossing there. I mean, I think there are some places where the Russians are stretched thinner in the Donbass. There maybe the Ukrainians could return to some kind of maneuver warfare. We saw around the Dobropilya area how when the Russians advanced too far, they were effectively cut off and attacked in 3 places by the Ukrainians. Now, if the Ukrainians are willing to allow the Russians to make some ground, take some territory, and then attack their flanks and their logistics, they can have success, and that's where they've had successes in the past. But there does seem to be a very serious political signal now that we will not lose any more territory. We cannot accept losing territory. And so you just have the Ukrainians falling back by fighting, and there's controlled advances, but there are Russian advances all the time. You feel like if the Ukrainians could resign themselves to losing a bit of territory, they might have more success in attacking kind of a stretched Russian line with stretched logistics.